You're listening to Carry On Friends, the Caribbean American podcast, episode 79. Welcome to the Carry On Friends podcast, where you'll be inspired and empowered to do amazing things in your personal lives, career, business, and community. With your host, Carrie Ann Reed Brown. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Carry On Friends, the Caribbean American podcast. I'm excited that you are listening. On today's show, we have guest Shawna Marie Aarons-Cook, who is a licensed clinical social worker. And the topic we'll be covering today is demystifying mental wellness within the Caribbean community. And this is actually, because we went so in depth, this is part one of a two-part episode on this particular topic. So in part one of the show, we talk about the modeling and the messaging that we've learned from family or culture that causes us to look at mental wellness as a weakness or unfavorably. We also talked about the shift to what she calls whole health, because studies are showing the link between physical health impacting mental health and vice versa, or the pressures of life affecting physical. And then our perception of mental wellness may cause us not to recognize when we need people or the people around us need the support of a professional. So without any further delay, here is part one of my interview with Shawna Marie. Hello, Shawna Marie. Welcome to the Carry On Friends podcast. Thank you so much for joining. How are you?
I am well, Carrie Ann. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate this opportunity.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So why don't you tell the community of friends a little bit about who you are?
Okay. Well, I am U.S. born of Jamaican parents. I'm first generation American. Mm-hmm. I am an author, psychotherapist, professional speaker, and gosh, I've done so many things, but I'll focus on that part because I think that's what's most relevant to your listeners today.
All right, cool. And so the topic that we're talking about is demystifying mental wellness, particularly in the Caribbean community. And so last year was a challenging year for me personally, and for a lot of people who it was just a challenging year, and so I wanted to have a topic where someone who has expertise in the area would be able to answer questions and talk about some of the challenges that our audience, whether they're just career focus, entrepreneurship focus, or they're doing both, and how, we could find some kind of support, takeaways, or tools to help us balance. And but the first and most important thing is demystifying mental wellness. So why is it important that we demystify mental wellness, particularly in the Caribbean American community or just the African American community as a whole?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about spreading information around mental health and wellness is about demystifying, the misconceptions, the myths, the stigma. We're inundated with messages 24/7 through media now more than at any point in our history, of humans walking this earth. Mm-hmm. But on top of that, the African American, the Caribbean experience, if you're a person of color, it is not uncommon for you to believe that you can overcome anything, for you to lean on and focus on your faith in a way that might have you looking down or ashamed on the possibility that mental health is something you would benefit from support with. I hope I didn't make that confusing the way that I said it.
No. That's very clear. It's like, toughen up, man. It's those repeated conversations. I gave an example, like growing up, if you kept hearing, stop an eyes or shut up. You kind of internalize those over time, and you realize that you start being quiet because that's kind of what you've been told for a while. So it's those messages that we hold on to.
But I would add the modeling, of
Mm-hmm.
what you see in your family, right? So if I look at my mom and dad, if I look at my grandparents and my great grandparents, they've been through things that I've never, ever had to endure.
Mm-hmm.
And not one of them ever has gone to therapy.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That is true.
And so when you start, kind of reflecting on how you grew up, how people deal with challenges, how they, I think of my grand uncle when he came back from the war and he was paraplegic.
Mm-hmm.
He never went to the VA to talk to anyone. Never. The way that our family, and I don't want to say like my family is what everyone does, but most of what I experienced in my family is not unusual when I think about the clients and families that I've worked with of Caribbean descent, right? So they are immediately, once they realize I'm Caribbean too, then they're like, oh, okay, so you know where I'm coming from, right? It's a secret. Like nobody knows I'm here. Nobody's supporting this decision. And not to say that there aren't people of Caribbean descent who do support and understand mental health, but it's usually for a specific reason. So let me go back to the kinds of things we're going to hear, right? If someone is talking in a way that doesn't make sense, the average person's going to say, stop talking foolishness.
Yeah.
If someone can't focus at work or at school, you're going to say, get it together. I can't say that is as consistent among other ethnicities. I think about the pride, when I first went to school and I brought home a form, and my father said, I said, oh, Daddy, the teacher gave me this. And he said, what is this? We don't take handouts. Why'd she give it to you? Did she give it to everybody? So, think about that. I'm in first, second grade. So that's just my own experience. I would be surprised if many other people of Caribbean descent or born and raised in the Caribbean doesn't have so much pride in who they are and what they overcome that they don't necessarily, that they would probably look at it as a bit of a weakness. And, historically, I was thinking about this. I said, gosh, well, how did people of color understand mental health and what have you? And historically, there's no time that humans have walked this earth where there weren't people who were what today are called mentally ill, but back at the days were called, mad, right? Touched, off. And they were treated from more of a spiritual perspective historically, in the sense that they'd pray over them. They would think that they were possessed. Whereas, in America, you start talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s, that's when it kind of became a field of practice, a field of learning where, people were trying to understand what's going on. Maybe they're not possessed. Maybe
Right.
maybe there's another explanation for this, and how do we understand it? So
and that's a good kind of background and framework that, culturally it's coming from a place of pride and not quite wanting other people to know your business. It's a perception of being weak. So then what really is mental wellness or therapy? What does it mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's still movement in this. So when you think about the terms for this field of mental health and wellness, it started out as mental illness, right? So first madness, then mental illness and disorders. And then they started moving into mental health because they realized that it was kind of stigmatizing to look at someone as mentally ill, that there's a disorder in their minds. And then now you're seeing a movement more around wellness. But even some of the best psychologists and psychiatrists have started to question the way that we talk about mental health and wellness, because they're saying, is it really just about your mind? Isn't it about your emotions? Isn't it about your behaviors? Isn't it about your environment? Aren't there circumstances where it would be appropriate to not be able to get out of bed and to be sad, and to have flashbacks, or kind of feeling like you're not in your body or you're not yourself based on the sheer volume of things that you've endured? So like the language is shifting even, to trauma, where people used to think of it as life or death situations, whereas now it's like when your ability to cope and endure is overwhelmed by your circumstances, your body's reacting the same way as if you was in a near-death experience. So, but what would be the value in understanding what mental health and wellness is? I think it's about realizing that if you're going to live the very best life that you can live, you've got to feel good. You got to be good in all aspects of your life. And so now mental health, behavioral health really is starting to vibrate around wellness in multiple areas. So your environment, your social interactions, your physical health. So it's like, I guess, think about whole health and then therefore think about wellness. Because like if someone is enduring a physical health challenge, that's going to impact how you feel. It's going to impact how you think. And if someone is enduring a significant financial challenge, that's going to impact how you think and how you feel as well, probably in the kind of choices that you make. And I think probably our greatest opportunity is when we think about the legacy of how we can show up in the lives of our children and in others. Because if we're not well, we're given from a place of hurt and deprivation. Our decisions are born out of pain.
And with pain, you lash out, you're reacting, you're trying to find relief, or it's where they say, misery love company, and so you do things, whether intentionally or, not knowingly hurting people around you because you're in pain, you're in pain and you don't have any other construct for relief. So I really liked, what you just said, and it totally makes sense to be, because, I think about growing up in the Caribbean, and, I remember growing up, there was this, they call them street people now in Jamaica, but back then they were just playing madman or madoman. And, in retrospect, and his name, everybody knew him as Dennis. I'm sure that wasn't his real name. Dennis was just had a mental, back then, I guess the proper word would be mental illness. And I'm not saying overwhelmed or stressed. There was something where he needed a support for. There was some developmental issue there, because as Caribbean people, developmental issues are also categorized into this madwoman situation. And so looking back at it, it was just, you the stigma, because what happens is when there's a mental development challenge or, something, they have nowhere to go. No one wants to keep them because it's shame and burden. And so somehow they end up on the street. So you kind of reflect on that. And then now, as you explain the transition from, mad to mental illness to the different terms, and recognizing how the stigma is what's preventing more people from getting the professional help that's available, it now makes sense, because the more, it doesn't seem to be going away. It's growing. The cases
not at all. And the fact is, the more that we understand the source of mental illness, the better we're able to prevent it, to alleviate it, and ideally to overcome for those who this is their path.
Right.
And the continuum of mental health. Because I think the same way that both you and I immediately, we have a person in our mind of who's mad, right? And that's the person who really needs help. And if you're not at that point,
Yeah, you tell
does it
yourself that
mean
I'm
that
okay.
right? Does it mean that your suffering couldn't benefit from support? And I think that would be my greatest concern around mental health and wellness, is that if it's not, quote, that bad, right? So if you have your child and your child is getting good enough grades, they're passing their classes, they're not disruptive, no one's referring them for counseling. Whether or not they're eating, whether or not they have a poor sense of self, whether or not they're able to develop strong, healthy relationships, they have a hard time concentrating, they're going to stay under the radar because they're functioning well enough. And that child, when he grows up, at some point is going to think that no matter what I have to deal with in life, I don't need help. I don't need support. And unfortunately, when you think about who commits suicide, it's men. Lethal suicide is men. Currently, the research shows that there's at least 1 in 5 people. Now, I'm sure you know more than 5 people, right? But at least 1 for every 5 is likely to have some form of mental health issue.
And so why is it mostly men? Why are men mostly affected?
Suicide? Yeah. So the interesting thing is women are more likely to identify mental health issues. They're more likely to explore services. Men are the least likely, and yet the suicide rate, like as far as the lethality in suicide, how successful they are, the types of suicides, it's really men. And I think part of it is, if you think of just American media and American men, what examples or images do we see of men being able to express their emotions?
Right.
What emotions are acceptable? Anger, frustration for disrespect.
Yep.
Right? But you don't really see a level of sensitivity and expression of self. I'm trying to remember what show it was I watched. I watched a show once where I just remember that the man was crying and everyone was like, is he gay? Like, what's wrong with him?
Right. And those are like it goes back to the language that we are using to kind of indirectly kind of shame people, into not realizing that this is a derogatory use of a word. And you then, by reacting that way, you give the other person a cue that what they're feeling is bad, or maybe I should keep this to myself and not share it. So yeah, those are like the terms that, people use. And I mean, we're talking about anything here. It could be, like for me, I told you last year I had a hard year. And the year before, the last couple of years, it's just been, I had a lot of loss in my family. And it was just like, it is so overwhelming. So mental wellness is, for me, dealing with life after the death of people who, you grew up with. Like, as Caribbean people, the relationship you have with your grandparents. Most of us have closer relationships with our grandparents than we do with our actual parents. And so, dealing with that loss where, as we've spoken before, like everything that happened to me in my life, the first people I called were, was the first person, grandma. When I moved from Jamaica to the U.S., like grandma write lots of letters. And as I'm cleaning out and preparing for the baby, I found like postcards grandma sent me. I'm turning 16. I'm never going to throw those away, but I pretty much kept every letter and postcard people gave me when I moved here. But looking at that and the relationship and the communication, it just kind of, I didn't need anyone else to tell me that I didn't need support to deal with this heavy loss. But like seeing that just kind of reminded me that, if you've had someone in your life for almost 40 years and they're gone, like that's 40 years of memories and experiences that you're coping with because they're no longer here. And so a lot of times people seem like, oh, they're in a better place and that should be enough for you. And it's not.
But part of what you're sharing just speaks to the value of what we call psychoeducation. You know, the more people that understand grief and loss, the more people who are going to empathize and support you during that transition beyond just saying, oh, you know, this too shall pass, he or she is in a better place. And the other thing is, it just reminds me of like the gift of therapy, you know, because I told this to a good girlfriend of mine. I said, you know, the longer that I do this work, the more I realize that therapy is the greatest gift, really, really the greatest gift that I've ever experienced in my life. Not just having been a recipient, but having been a provider. Mm-hmm. Because what happens is you get into the habit of understanding yourself.
Yes.
Of understanding how your mind works, how your emotions works. Being clear as far as what you're feeling and letting those feelings come out with no shame. Mm-hmm. You know, and it could be something little. I remember once, you know, I had a breakup and my girlfriend called and she goes, oh, what's the matter? It sounds like you're upset. I said, oh, you know, we just broke up. And I started crying. She's like, oh, stop crying. I said, no, girl, I'm in touch with my feelings. I got to get this out. Well, but that's what psychoeducation teaches you. Mm-hmm. So, you know, as a kid growing up, as a young adult, I wouldn't have understood that. But training in therapy, training in mental health and psychology, I know it doesn't serve me to repress my feelings. Mm-hmm. It actually serves me to be able to feel what I'm feeling and get to the other side of it. Mm-hmm. You know, and, you know, the other thing, I forgot to say this earlier when I think about mental health, because I've had this conversation so many times with family members and friends of the family, primarily Caribbean. And they're like, what good is talking about the past, right? Mm. It's already done. Mm-hmm. That's not going to help me now. Mm-hmm. And I was like, therapy doesn't really mean that you're talking about the past. Therapy is really about this moment. What are you thinking and feeling right now? At times, what you're thinking and feeling right now does have to do with things you've experienced before. And so to be able to go back and look at it when it's appropriate, then it helps you get perspective. Mm-hmm. You know, I think, you know, when you think about the islands, I think about how isolated sometimes you can be, how things happen in families, whether it's incest, whether it's sexual abuse and molestation, whether, you know, like you get jumped, and how that can impact your life and then still run in the background if you never go back and address it.
Right.
So does it mean that you're going to sit there and talk about where you were born and how long and who used to call you, you know, little baby Carrie? I mean, like, you're not just like shooting the poo in there. I mean, not with a good therapist. We're really going to be asking you about how are you right now? Mm-hmm. And at times, you know, and where do you want to go?
Right.
But it is not uncommon that, you know, like we can pick up patterns.
Yeah. I was just about to say, right? The one good thing about, and there's debate, but I'll just use from a high level. The one good thing about like some of these shows, right? So let's take Yanla Fix My Life. She consistently says the patterns and pathology that affect, you know, your future behavior, your current or your future decisions. And it's, and she's not spending time on the past, but like how you're behaving now, a lot of times are kind of dictated by past experiences and kind of moving along. So that was kind of the first time, like, you know, evaluating patterns and behaviors are the undercurrent, and we've pushed them aside for so long, or say, well, that doesn't matter. That's how we used to do things, and think that, you know, that's fine. And I mean, not just with mental wellness, it's just with everything. It's just like there was this joke where, you know, someone was cooking and the mom kept doing, I can't remember what she did. She did a particular thing. And so every time, you know, that this recipe was passed down, they did that. And one day, one person asked, why do you do that? I'm like, I don't know. My mom did it, and her mom before that did it.
Right.
You know, so it's just like watching and mimicking the behavior, not knowing why you do it, but it's just because it's what's done. So, and that's a pattern. So, I mean, a pattern doesn't always, you know, patterns are helpful clues, I believe, to help us figure out why we do certain things, why we behave a certain way, why do we react a certain way. So, I like that you said with therapy, exploring the past might come up, but it's more of where you are now, what you'd like to do, and when appropriate, exploring the past might give clues as to why we do or feel or, behave a certain way.
When it's necessary, and there was a movie a million years ago called Groundhogs Day.
Yes.
Where, every day he wake up and lives the same day over and over again until he changed, until he truly changed. And that's how we live our lives. We navigate lives, like with no instruction book. There's no key card or guidebook. And we're going to relive the same patterns, the same experience, the same kind of mistakes, if you will, and missteps until we learn to do otherwise. So you could learn exclusively that way, right? You got to run into the wall to realize, okay, don't run into walls. You put your hand in the fire, realize fire burn. Or you can take the collection of experiences that you've had so far and have the support of an objective other professional who can help you see what patterns may be occurring that you don't realize yourself, to help you identify what you might want to change and what you might want to stay the same. You may find out that the recipe that your great-grandma used to use, you want to still do it that way. But at least now you know why you're doing it, as opposed to not understanding why. And when you were talking about fix my life, I was like, gonna be quiet.
No. Let me tell you. I know. I'm just using on a higher level, using the terms. There's a lot. There's certain terms that, like the pattern, like the one thing she says over and over again. That's the one takeaway. I'm not talking about the people on the show or anything else on the show.
Yeah. No, and I appreciated the way you framed it. It worked. I was like, okay, good. We're on good ground here.
Yeah.
But I do think it brings to light the possibility that some of the images we see in the media, we have to understand that it's for entertainment.
Yeah.
Not all of, as a mental health professional, that's a very difficult show for me to support because there is a bit of a dismissal of professional psychotherapy. There's mischaracterization as to what it actually is. And, even you take someone like maybe a Dr. Phil or people who are mental health professionals and in the public eye, it doesn't necessarily mean that what you see isn't influenced by the fact that it is television.
Right.
So there's lots of things that I see on those shows that I would never do. Never do. And many therapists would never put you in a situation where you're being exposed to the negative thoughts and opinions of others that you still have to go home
and deal with.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's my whole thing about reality shows. Just the exposure and the openness of wounds and what happens when you go home. Because, that's a whole different. That's a whole different conversation.
There's one thing that I did want to say about the physiological aspect of mental health and wellness and repression, because I'm not so sure that people realize that we now have research which speaks to medical conditions that can be linked to intense stress, to mental and emotional distress, and the habit of repressing feelings. So those feelings energetically are still activated in your body. And it is not unusual for there to be medical conditions that surface as a result or a correlate to what you're feeling and repressing. And so when people ask me, what's the purpose of talking about it? And I'm quick to say to get it out of you. To get it out of you, because you don't talk about it doesn't mean it isn't still happening inside of you and isn't repressed and stuck in your body.
I mean, that makes sense because we hear this all the time in different forms. And I remember, I know it was fairly recently where someone went into the hospital. They had a medical diagnosis and the doctor said, well, you know what? I can tell you what the diagnosis is and we could treat it, but I can tell you from my professional experience that, the patients who do well are the patients who, mentally, they aren't saying, oh my God, this is it for me. They mentally, they go to a place where, whether it's spiritual or whatever. So I think what you're saying if people are still like skeptical about mental wellness or whole wealth or whole health, it's in the simplest form. The doctor will say, you could have this diagnosis, but I've seen patients pray, they have a positive attitude, and those are the patients that get better. So what you're saying, the correlation with our physical, our bodies and our minds are connected in the opposite, where if you have positive thoughts, or you are, and it's beyond positive thoughts, because you can't just think positive and everything changes, but truly and deeply have a mindset that is more is healthy, and you're able to I can't find the word, but it has a more positive effect on your family. Whereas if you are in some kind of mental distress, or there's some just high emotional distress. That's the word you use, distress.
Yeah.
It has that impact on your body. It's like you can't get out of bed, you can't, all these.
Well, and that's why I was saying it's a little challenging when we say mental health and wellness, because it really, so much of our mental health and wellness and our physical health and wellness has to do with our emotional regulation.
Yes.
How are we processing our emotions? And are we doing that on a regular and consistent basis? Are we giving space? One of the greatest challenges that I often experience in therapy is people's inability to distinguish and identify their own feelings. Because it's about, like, what do you think? Yeah. What's happening in your mind? And if I say, well, what's the feeling that's coming in? And they're like, well, I feel like he doesn't understand me. But babe, that's not a feeling. That's sad, happy. Like, where do you get that education? And at this time, you get it in therapy.
Yeah.
You get it in therapy. And, the other thing I think that sometimes people they worry is it's going to sound so, I'll just say it though, is that it's a white people thing. That's an American thing. They have the luxury of doing that. And I guess I look at it more as if, and this is now, 20 years later.
Yeah.
I look at it as, why wouldn't I and people I care about benefit and give themselves the gift of therapy, of a safe place, of one person who's dedicated to their mental health, emotional health, and life success? Why not? And I think that's what the shift is going to be, and it's interesting because right now, the way that we have kind of accepted having a support person is like, oh, it's a life coach, So it's like, I do therapy and life coaching, and it's hilarious to me. People come, they're like, oh, I need a coach. And I was like, really? How did you come to that decision? It's like, well, I don't want to talk about my past. I really want to get things done. There's not one coaching client that I have ever had where we are not also doing some unpacking about their self-care, about their understanding of themselves, about healthy emotional regulation and processing, communications. That's happening anyway. It's like, but whatever door you need to come through, I'm here.
And I think the challenge that you're having with life coach is the proliferation of so many coaches, and that's a whole different conversation. So I want to kind of get into what we talked about. And I think we talked about this normalized behavior in the Caribbean. We talk about, things that we do because it's just what you do. It's just like, there's this popular meme going around, like, believe in yourself like Jamaicans believe in tea, because for everything we drink tea. And I'm one of them. Like, I love tea. I'm not a coffee drinker. I love my tea. So, we have behaviors or things that we, they're comfort, like that. Those are things that we go to because, this is normal. When you feel this way, you just drink some tea, you bathe in some, first you bathe, you drink tea, and you lie down. Those are the things that we should do. I want to talk more about how these normalized behaviors are placebos in a way. And here's why. So I was listening to a podcast episode with TD Jakes, and I can't remember, but he said, you know, he was talking about how someone is sick. He said, don't be sick and say God gonna heal you and you're not gonna take your pills. He's like, take the pills, and when you're healed, it's the line. And when he said it, I was like, oh my gosh, it's so there's this line also of like, God is going to heal me, so I don't need all of these things. But it's this balance of if God is. I think we always look to the supernatural, and taking pills is not supernatural. So so those are just some of the things that culturally we deal with, and TD Jakes is speaking to a primarily Black audience, because if you go back, no other race is gonna get pills and say I'm not taking them. It's people of African American or African diaspora who's gonna say, well, there's a more supernatural way to deal with it. And I'm not saying the supernatural isn't involved, but essentially he was saying, if you get pills from the doctor, you take those pills, because if you think God is going to heal you in some supernatural way, it may not work for you. It may work for sister so-and-so, but that may not work for you.
Yeah, well, that some of that is deeply embedded, multi-generational embedded. And I wouldn't say it's exclusive to the Black, Caribbean, African diaspora, but we probably more hardcore about it, right? A little more hardcore. Sure. But, like Christian Science is a tradition that for many years did not believe in what's called materia medica. They did not take medications and didn't believe in it. It's only probably maybe in the 2000s that started to be more acceptable, where they understood, like, no, we can still take pills. It's not completely against our faith. But what you're bringing up to me comes across as about a faith walk. And so if you and I had a case that was a game changer for me. I worked in the psychiatric inpatient unit for children and adolescents. And I had a teenage girl who came in because she had attempted suicide by taking 2 bottles of pills. And she was in her home, didn't go to school for a week. She wasn't feeling well. It was what she reported to her parent and her grandparent. And so after about the 3rd or 4th day, they brought their church sisters and did a prayer circle for her. And they held a prayer vigil for 3 days. By day 6 or 7, she finally goes back to school, and she's still a little bit out of it. And it was the school counselor who said, let's have you see the nurse. And when she disclosed about the pills, they sent her to the emergency room. She's lucky to be alive. Mm-hmm. She is lucky to be alive because, I, as a spiritual person, a faithful person, I respected their ability to lean on their faith, mm-hmm. but I also had to point out that their faith did not prohibit them from seeking medical attention. And I think that's the line we have to be careful that we're not crossing. Mm-hmm. So, when I used to do a lot of presentations in churches, and that's actually how I switched from primarily spiritual counseling to full integrated spiritual and mental health. And it was because the amount of people who would come up to me ashamed, like, I have faith. I just sometimes think about killing myself, and I know it's a sin, And it became clear to me that there was more. It's more than just about your faith. And why would we not explore what mental health and, medicine have to offer? And I could give an example. I worked with a woman, she was Haitian, and she used to come to me for prayer. And she said, I have this woman doing obia, and she didn't call it that. She called it voodoo. But she had this woman doing incantations in her home. And when I went to her home to pray with her, I saw that woman. I said, she's schizophrenic. And she was like, why would you say that? No, she's mentally ill. She's not possessed. Look at her eyes. Mm-hmm. She's not in her mind. She's not here. This is a psychotic episode. And she's like, that never occurred to me. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, she had been praying and, lighting candles and, doing stuff for years to pray this woman away. And so, I do think that we have some room to grow as far as realizing that the spiritual answers a lot for us and it never leaves us. But it doesn't mean that we want to have blind eyes around other aspects of life.
Right.
Right. The medical, the physical, and so and so. But, when it comes to normalized behavior and risk, I think some of the risks that we have to do with, like, for example, smoking or drinking, and maybe having a little more tolerance for, this is what we do and it's a part of our culture and we're a happy people and we'll make it through.
Right.
All right, so this is where we're going to end part 1 of the episode with Shawna Marie. Join us for the next episode of the Carry On Friends podcast, where we continue the discussion and Shawna Marie takes on some audience questions. Again, thank you for listening. I hope that you found this informative and you will share this information with your friends, your family, and your colleagues. Okay, friends, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Carry On Friends podcast. For a recap of this episode and other great articles, please visit the blog at www.carryonfriends.com. That's CarryonFriends.com.